As some of you may already know, I have started my podcast. I did a little announcement yesterday. This, however, today is going to be the first episode, which is actually dedicated to discussing some, as I think, important issues of contemporary international politics and geopolitics. Whereas yesterday, as again some of you may know, was basically dedicated to just introducing the format. So without further ado, this is my podcast, The Ninth Wave. My name is Tariq Sirama, just to repeat this again. I'm a historian by training, but I also have become very interested recently, and I have turned myself to an extent into a commentator on contemporary politics, geopolitics, international politics, in particular questions that have to do with the, as I think, very critical state of the world that we are now in. Today, what I would like to do is discuss two main topics, and unfold them, unpack them a little bit, my view of them, obviously, which is all I can offer you in all modesty or immodesty, maybe. The first one has still to do with the developing very tense situation, the conflict really, between Israel on one side and Iran on the other side. And the second one that I will speak about second as well is about what happened yesterday at the United Nations, where, as many of you will already know, the United States has once again blocked a Palestinian attempt to finally become a full member state of the United Nations, as Palestine, of course, by any reasonable understanding of fundamental ethics and international law should be. But we are going to talk about this in a little more detail in the second part of this podcast. So first of all, I have an urge, as it were, to say a few things about this exchange between Israel and Iran that is occurring right now. I apologize if I repeat myself. For some of you who may have seen me talk on other venues about this before, or who have read what I've written about it. Fundamentals first, it is absolutely clear that Iran is in the right, and that is in terms of international law. I am aware that the General Secretary of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who has his lighter moments from time to time, but usually is a rather disappointing official, has had a very disappointing moment again and tried to both side this Iranian-Israeli conflict right now and pretend that Iran is equally bad, as it were, as Israel. That is nonsense. And I think the better part of his brain probably actually knows that. That is nonsense simply in terms of international law. Once Israel launched the attack, the really state terror attack on Iran's consular building on diplomatic premises next to the embassy itself in Damascus, that was clearly an act of war. It doesn't matter that the Israelis apply the usual policy of letting us all know very well that they did it, but then not making it explicit. That is completely irrelevant. It is very clear that Israel carried out an act of war against Iran by striking at what is Iranian territory under international law, namely its embassy premises in Damascus. Once that happened, there were really two ways that could go. The United Nations, in particular the United Nations Security Council, could have taken over, as it were, for better or worse, and tried to do something about this particular strike and this crisis. But because of Western intervention from states like, of course, foremost the United States, but also the UK, for example, that did not happen. And once that does not happen under international law, and this is reflected in the UN Charter itself, in the famous Article 51, a state simply retains its full right to self-defense, right? If the United Nations Security Council is not stepping in to help you when you're being attacked, then, and this is actually basic logic, that the people who drew up the charter understood too, then you retain your right to look after yourself, right? And Iran clearly retained this right. They waited for 2 weeks. That's a very long time. Until they retaliated. The Iranian retaliation was perfectly legitimate under international law. Another thing, of course, that I've written about before is the fact that it was also exemplarily restrained, even humane, right? It is true that it involved several hundreds of drones and missiles, but it is also true that the Iranians clearly knew and calculated, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, from the beginning that most of those wouldn't even reach Israel, right? This was a strike that the Iranians themselves designed to be mostly harmless. Mostly. We'll get back to that as well. Let me remind you that it didn't take, according to at least Israeli and other sources, a single life. There was one civilian girl that was apparently severely injured. That, of course, is a tragedy. But please compare this what Israel is doing when it is trying to make an impression. Israel is habitually slaughtering civilians. We know by now that it is doing this. We've always known it is doing this deliberately. But by now we know that it is doing this deliberately with the help of artificial intelligence, right? This gets us into the territory of Lavender, Where's Daddy, the gospel, and similar killing machines that the Israelis have not only built, but that they're using excessively. And it's not only Israel. Imagine that someone had attacked an American embassy in a similar way. Maybe not immediately, but sooner or later, the United States would have struck back in a way that would not have been as restrained as what Iran did. Civilians would certainly have died in such a US strike. We all know this, and we have to understand comparison is very fair here, that the Iranian response up until now, really should enter history as a textbook case of trying to square the circle between maintaining your deterrence capacity as a state, which they had to do, between retaliating when this is actually under international law, you're very clear, right? And at the same time, doing it in a way that doesn't cost even lives. Now, the aspect I'd really like to add today is that recently I have seen, and I'm sure many of you have seen, arguments by smart people, right? These are not implausible or silly arguments, but I still don't believe in them. Arguments by smart people that all we need to really think about this initial Iranian strike. Nobody knows the future. We don't know what will happen after last night and today, of course. But there are arguments that this initial Iranian strike, those over 300 missiles and drones fired at Israel, most of them caught, but not all of them, by air defenses, that this initial Iranian strike was just for show, that it was sort of a comedy, right? Not to be taken very seriously, and that in fact, it only shows how much power the United States has to, in this case, force Iran into a comedic response instead of a serious one. I think this is a very misguided and mistaken take, and I want to explain very quickly why I think that. It is true that precisely because Tehran obviously tried to avoid bloodshed, it in many ways de facto cooperated, right, with the United States. There were meetings, there were contacts, and so on, to avoid that bloodshed, and that it shaped its attack in a way that did exactly that, avoid bloodshed. But that does not mean it was just for show. There was a show element in this, but you really have to dig a little bit deeper here. One thing we shouldn't overlook is that if this means that to an extent Iran, in planning this initial response, went along with the United States, it also means that the United States went along with Iran. Don't forget that. That's a very important factor. This is also a sign of Tehran's power, right? This was a deal. And if it was a deal and not an imposition, right, then that means that both sides exerted power here. This is very unlike the narrative that the United States would want us to believe, right? Secondly, the idea that this is simply irrelevant because, in the end, the combined air defense capacities of Israel, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Jordan was in the mix, and I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody. The idea that this is an irrelevant strike because these amassed air defense capacities managed to neutralize most of these attacking drones and missiles is bogus, completely bogus, for two reasons. One is some of the missiles did get through. And as Scott Ritter, I think, has explained extensively somewhere else, so I won't try to recapitulate him here. He's much better at this. That is a major fact, right? Actually hitting one of the most important Israeli air bases with 5, 9, 7, I've seen different figures, missiles, in spite of all this air defense, is a major fact. That was not for show. That was a signal that Iran can do things that are much more damaging. And of course, a high Iranian official has by now come out and said exactly that. And I believe them. I think this is absolutely true. They're not spinning here. He has essentially said we have used dated types of weapons on this, and we have more modern ones. And moreover, we have a lot of them. And here, once again, I would like to draw your attention to what has been happening in the war in Ukraine between, on one side, obviously Ukraine, which is used as a proxy by its Western sponsors, and on the other side, Russia. Russia is now succeeding. It's succeeding on the ground, but it is also succeeding massively in the air. And one key to this success is that Russia, over a campaign that with ups and downs has actually lasted more than a year now, has systematically saturated and degraded Ukrainian air defenses. And the lesson of that particular war and the way it has unfolded is that if you have enough of a military industrial complex, if you have enough engineering, enough production capacity, or allies who have the engineering and the production capacity, to build a large number of simple but also sophisticated drones and missiles, if you can create that mix and produce a lot of that, right? Then you are in a place that you can outweigh the most sophisticated air defenses now. Right? Here, the advantage, this is a historic shift in a way, has clearly shifted to the attacker. Right? Compare this a little bit to what happened before World War One, and then in World War One it became obvious. Some people had predicted it. For example, the author Mark Bloch. What happened before World War One was that the defense became much more powerful because of machine guns, because of the velocity of bullets from ordinary guns, and so on and so on. Right? You can all read it up in Mark Bloch's wonderful work that he published years before World War One. And then, of course, that led to the long immobility of the war on the Western Front. The Eastern Front was different, but the Western Front, right? So World War One, in some ways, for a long time, it doesn't stay the same way until the end, is a war that is characterized by an advantage for defensive military techniques and technologies, right? What we have seen here and what we are seeing in Ukraine and what Iran, I think, has hinted at is that right now the advantage in air war actually begins to lie with the attacker again. And the reason is that even the most sophisticated air defense systems can be overwhelmed if you have enough and enough quality. Now, don't forget that Iran is obviously closely connected by now with both Russia and also with China and with the BRICS Plus world, the emerging multipolar order as a whole. You know, of course, that in Russia's strategy in Ukraine, right, Iranian weapons and Iranian designs have played a role, right? You can turn this around. In a future all-out conflict between Israel and Iran, Iran would also be able to draw on support from other countries with powerful military-industrial complexes, right? Now, I'm not saying that this predicts the end of such a war, right? As some people have rightly pointed out, this might all be very true. But of course, before Israel would suffer the fate that Ukraine is suffering now, they would perhaps reach for the nuclear weapons that they officially don't have, their perfectly rogue arsenal, or do something else that is entirely insane because it's Israel after all, right? That is true, but the fundamental fact remains Iran has also demonstrated that was a very serious show, as it were, that this can happen to Israel. And of course, the third major point is that it is completely irrelevant how much advanced coordination there was with the United States. It is also irrelevant how much advanced warnings the Iranians very humanely telegraphed to the Israelis before and during this attack. This is completely irrelevant to one fact. The Iranian position towards Israel has now shifted indeed, not in words, this is important, from what is called strategic patience, which is basically we take it and turn the other cheek when the Israelis go after us, to no more strategic patience. They've been very clear about this. Their position now is if they attack us anywhere, not only on Iranian soil, we will retaliate onto Israeli soil. This is a very different setup. Now, we will see in how far Iran will actually apply this. The doctrinal shift is definitely there, and it will matter in the future. It is, of course, possible that they will make exceptions for one or the other reasons, right? One test is how they will apply to what was apparently a fairly small Israeli attack that happened last night, right? That's one of the first tests, and we don't know what exactly Iran will do. But here's the point. It isn't really so important if Iran consistently applies a new doctrine of retaliation, which is what has emerged here, right? The important thing is that Iran has made it clear that the old doctrine of strategic patience is gone. Once that happens, the Israelis are already in a situation which is fundamentally more unpredictable and insecure for them than before. Because even if they can still ask themselves, well, is Tehran going to go through with this every single time we do something? They have to ask themselves now. And they have to live with the possibility that every single time they do something, Tehran may very well go through with what I've just called the new doctrine of retaliation. That insecurity is already in play, whatever else happens next, right? So there are other things to discuss here, but I don't want to make this too long. But I had sort of, as I told you, an urge to respond to some of those oversimplifications I believe that I have seen, and that allege that this initial Iranian strike was somehow really not very important. It was extremely important, and it will be very important going forward. Now let's talk about the second topic that I would like to raise today, which is what happened yesterday at the UN. In short, I really leave out the formalities and the technicalities. They're all there, of course, one can read up on them. But in short, the Palestinian Authority, right, in the name of Palestine, the state of Palestine, right, for which it stands, for better or worse, different issue, made another attempt to obtain for Palestine full membership status at the United Nations. Right? At this moment, Palestine is a state with observer status at the United Nations, which is quite different. For example, it means you have no voting rights. Right? There are real differences involved here. No need to be cynical about them. They actually matter. Right? I would like to get one thing out of the way. What I've seen from Israeli commentators doing their best to lie and obfuscate, as they always do, in the most primitive ways, it's almost disappointing how brutish their lies have become. Well, probably they've always been very brutish, really. Have tried to obfuscate the issue and to pretend that this was about the recognition of Palestine as a state. That is completely untrue. Please keep these two things very separate. The reality is that as of the year before last year, as of April 2022, right, that's the last figure I could find today, 138 states in the world have recognized Palestine as a state. 138 states in the world have already recognized Palestine as a state. That is the majority, as you know, right? The UN has 193 members. I think there are few states out there that aren't even members. We have about 200 states on the planet. If 138 acknowledge your state, you are acknowledged by a very fundamental criterion of customary international law, which is you get acknowledged as a state by being acknowledged by a lot of states. This has already happened for Palestine. This is done. This is done. This is not about the recognition of Palestine as a state. That's in. And by the way, as a lapsed Catholic, lapsed Roman Catholic, I'm pleased to inform you that even the Vatican has already recognized Palestine as a state. And if you add the Vatican, which is an unusual state, I know, you get to 139 states as of April 2022. So what happened yesterday at the UN was something quite different. It was whether that recognized state of Palestine will be finally made a full member. Now, the scandal, of course, is that it isn't yet, because there's absolutely no reason why Palestine, unlike so many other recognized states, which Palestine is, should not be a full member of the United Nations. Everybody is on the planet. Virtually every state on the planet is or can be a member of the United Nations. This is not an exclusive club, right? So to withhold that from Palestine is scandalous. It's highly exceptional, highly unusual. It is really bizarre, right? And of course, we find the United States doing precisely that. So that was my little preface here. But I would like to speak about two statements from the Israeli side, actually, because nefarious and mendacious as they are, and they really are, they form good starting points to think about a few important issues here. So the first statement I would like to refer to in that manner is by the Israeli foreign minister, right? I think his name is Israel Katz. So the Israeli foreign minister reacted to the United States by its veto in the UN Security Council, withholding full membership from Palestine by saying the following: the shameful proposal, he means the proposal to finally give Palestine full UN membership, of course, here, right? The shameful proposal was rejected. Terrorism will not be rewarded. That was the statement by the Israeli foreign minister. Now let's unpack this a little bit. I know it's annoying. I know it is literally a revolting statement, right? It makes me angry reading stuff like that. But it's worth paying a little bit of close attention here. First of all, what Israel habitually calls terrorism is, of course, the armed resistance to which Palestinians have a right. This is not a matter of taste. This is not a matter of opinion. This is not where you stand, right, left, center. It doesn't matter. Under international law, if you don't believe it, look it up, the Palestinians have a right to armed resistance, as for instance, China has recently underlined, and others as well, right? This is a very, very clear-cut case. The Palestinians have a right to take up arms and fight against Israel, because Israel is an occupying power and an oppressor. And international law, flawed as it is, actually recognizes that people to whom that happens are entitled to resist. And that right of armed resistance is not dependent, as some people try to insinuate again and again, on whether you are a good Democrat, whether you run a state that is liberal, whether you run a state that is in good connections with the West. All of this doesn't matter at all. It doesn't matter. A people that is targeted by certain types of oppression and occupation, and of course, in Palestine's case, also annexation de facto and actually formal in East Jerusalem, a people to whom that happens has a right to armed resistance, right? If somebody tries to tell you that the Palestinians have a duty to play Gandhi and only Gandhi, and I admire Gandhi, don't get me wrong, right? But he doesn't fit everywhere. That is, yeah, they can resist, but they cannot actually be violent. That is wrong. that person has unmasked him or herself as an ignoramus of international law. The international law situation is exactly the opposite. Certain types of oppression, they're widely recognized to be happening to the Palestinians, entitle the oppressed to armed resistance. The oppressed may choose not to use this right. That's a different issue, but the right is definitely there. So, when Israel talks of terrorism, that's what they're really talking about. And of course, it's a strategy, right, to mislabel this rightful, legitimate armed resistance as terrorism so as to marginalize the Palestinians even further. But then the other term that struck me in the Israeli foreign minister's statement was will not be rewarded. Well, first of all, who does he think he is? Who does he think he is? The nanny of the world? Rewarding? If the world was a place where rewards and punishments are dished out by anybody according to what governments or maybe whole states deserve, Israel would be in for horrific punishment already for genocide, for apartheid, for war crimes, for various crimes against humanity, right? To hear an Israeli foreign minister get on their high horse and pretend they can speak about rewards that other states and people really might get or not get is again revolting. But let's dwell on it. Let's dwell on it because we can ask, I think, a fairly useful question, which is okay, if your argument, Foreign Minister of Israel, is that the armed resistance of the Palestinians will not be rewarded, that's what we are really talking about here, then let's ask what has been rewarded. Because the Palestinians have tried a lot of things before, right? We've had diplomacy and compromise, the Oslo Accords, and everything that came out of that. And please don't believe the fairy tales about how the Palestinians didn't take the deal. Please, I've had enough of that. Maybe I speak about this in another show, in another episode, but right now let's focus on something substantial. Since the Oslo Accords of the early 1990s, some of you probably weren't even born yet, right? I was. Since the Oslo Accords of the early 1990s, there has been an extended attempt to use good faith, diplomacy, negotiation, and compromise with Israel. And the reason it never worked is that Israel doesn't want it to work. That's how simple this is. Israel is not a good faith partner for negotiations and has never been. Negotiations for Israel are a stalling technique, and the stalling is dedicated to create enough space and time so that Israel can actually take over all the territory and completely subjugate the Palestinians. This is what this really is, right? So diplomacy is not being rewarded for the Palestinians. We know this already. This is a historical fact. This is empirically observable. Now, what about nonviolent resistance? Let's talk about the Gandhi options, right? A lot of people think that the Palestinians never tried. Oh, they did try. For instance, in the March of Return. And the usual answer of Israel, no, not the usual, the permanent answer of Israel to nonviolent resistance is extreme violence. Shooting to kill, shooting to cripple. We could go into the details, but you can easily look them up. It is a myth that the Palestinians have never tried to be constructive. They have tried diplomacy, they've even tried nonviolent resistance, and a lot of people don't know this because it's being lied about so much. Even Hamas has at times tried with implying that they would recognize Israel. Oh yes, it happened. And the answer was, of course, that Israel ratcheted up the violence immediately because they don't want anything like that to come out and work. That's not part of their strategy. They don't want a compromise, right? So what about another strategy that the Palestinians could, of course, adopt in the face of this enormous oppression and this land robbing and the ethnic cleansing and the genocide that sometimes is slow motion and sometimes fast motion, right? They could cooperate. Well, it happens in history. Nobody has to be an angel or hero all the time. That's demanding the impossible. When whole communities are faced with massive oppression by a militarily far superior enemy, backed up by the most powerful state in the world, criminally, the United States, of course, some of those representatives of those communities will cooperate. You can also call it collaboration if you want to have a term that has a little more oomph attached to it. And of course, that is the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is the institution and the face of Palestinian cooperation, or if you want to give it a slight polemical edge, collaboration. And what has that got them? Exactly nothing. Exactly nothing. So, what I wanted to dwell on here is that this whole talk about rewards, it is not only disgustingly arrogant, it is also perversely mendacious. Nothing that the Palestinians have ever done has been rewarded in any way because Israel and its allies, most of all the United States, have never been serious about striking a just compromise, even that. And of course, the Palestinians, let's talk about that another time, deserve actually more than a compromise. But let's let it rest for now here. Here's a second statement from the Israeli side that I found telling. You all know probably Gilad Erdan, the Israeli ambassador to the UN, a man who stands out by his rudeness, his arrogance, even by Israeli standards. That guy really is striking. I mean, by his effortless lying all the time. That's pretty much default, but still, he's doing his very best. By his shameless instrumentalization of the Holocaust. And I take the Holocaust actually very seriously. In my first book, it was discussed at length. And I think that when men like Erdogan wear a yellow star to the United Nations to score political points, they disrespect the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. They instrumentalize them. They use them for cheap, miserable, and oppressive politics. So that's what I think about that guy. And nevertheless, let's listen to one of his statements yesterday. So here's what he said. The only thing that forced unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state will do is to make any future negotiations almost impossible. So look, we've already talked about the fact that this whole thing wasn't about recognition. Recognition has already happened from the vast majority of states in the world. Palestine is a recognized state. Mr. Erdogan has nothing there, right? So he's clearly just obfuscating again, right? He's trying to muddy the waters, make you think that the whole issue is different from what it actually is. But let's concentrate on the rest, right? Forced. He says forced. What does he mean by forced? Who's forcing anybody? What I see is that, in essence, a vast majority of states in the UN is ready to take this perfectly just and overdue step of giving Palestine finally what is its due, full membership. And the only ones who are forcing anything here are the Israelis and the US, standing alone and isolated, actually. They are forcing the rest of the world not to do in the UN what the rest of the world clearly wants to do. That's the force here. Nobody's forcing anything except the United States acting on behalf of Israel, right? So the other thing, unilateral? Unilateral means one-sided in the sense of it comes only from one side. Wait a minute, the vast majority of UN states are ready to do this, and you're talking about one-sided? The only one-sided thing here, once again, is Israel and the United States. They are alone on this now. And rightly so, right? And then the last point, he threatens, this is a threat, of course, right? If you give Palestine full UN membership at long last, then this will make, he says, any future negotiations almost impossible. There are two things about this. Negotiations, future and actually in the past, are impossible with Israel because Israel is the most mendacious state in the world. I really can't think of a worse case. There may be states that do other things worse, but in terms of standard default dishonesty as a policy all the time, everywhere, Israel beats them all. Israel is an incredibly mendacious, bad faith actor. Its nuclear weapons don't exist, but they're there. It's a complete rogue state with nukes. It de facto annexes the West Bank, but it calls it an occupation. It has pretended for years that somehow Gaza is out of its control, while it has held a siege over it, actually since 2007, right? Not just now, it's just escalated now, right? It pretends that it's a democracy. But you cannot be a democracy when millions of people you rule do not have the vote. That doesn't compute. That is complete nonsense, right? For all those liberal Orwell fans out there, Orwell would have kicked your ass for that absurdity. That is an absurdity of language. When a government rules millions of occupied subjects who, by definition, among many other disadvantages, do not vote, you obviously do not have a democracy. It is nonsense. There's nothing to discuss here. We could go on and on and on. But the fundamental problem why future negotiations with Israel are not likely, or I think are impossible, he may be right there, actually, is that Israel cannot negotiate. They're psychologically, politically, intellectually unwilling and incapable. The only language they've ever used is imposition, force, and manipulation. They don't negotiate. They've made that very, very clear. And instead of negotiating, when it comes to the crunch, they also resort to genocide, which is what they're doing now, right? Now, there is another reason that I think Israeli officials should be aware why the phrase future negotiations rings a little bit hollow, which is, you should be so lucky. You should be so lucky. Because you know what? There may be a future, I think there will be a future, in which the others will not want to negotiate with Israel anymore. I know it doesn't look like it now. I know Jordan has helped Israel against Iran, becoming another emblematic case of that, well, virtual treason that is happening in the Middle East as well, where a lot of countries and states that should help the Palestinians don't actually do so, or even want to play balls with Israel, right? But I know that the United States are still the most powerful state in the world. Yes, they're run by a president who mistakes Haifa for Rafah, right? But they still have their guns. It's true. But nevertheless, the balance of power is shifting. And I think that Israel is built on sand. It's a house built on sand, and it will not stand there much longer, historically speaking. So if I were an Israeli, I wouldn't spit on negotiations. They may need them one day, very, very urgently, when they will have to talk to victors and try to get these victors to be kinder and much more humane to them than they have ever been to those victors, right? So that's what I was going to say for today. Let me add one last sentence. It's almost like a postscriptum, right? But I don't want to leave this episode without saying it. With everything going on in Iran, with Iran, Israel, at the UN, let's not forget that the genocide against Gaza, in Gaza, and also in the West Bank is continuing. It has not stopped. The obstruction of the United States against putting at least a ceasefire in place is still working. We know that the United States and Israel have talked about Israel invading Rafah, right? This is what Biden really tried to say in his way that combines being senile with lying. The single worst crime, it's not the only one. There are a lot of others, I know. But I would say the single worst crime right now against a large group of human beings is still continuing. Essentially, 34,000 are already counted officially as dead. We have to assume it's many more. These are conservative figures. We also know that 7,000, 13,000, we can't exactly know, are missing. The sadism is continuing. The starvation is continuing. None of this has stopped. So don't take your eye off it. In that sense, we should all thank and also support as far as we can. For instance, they're not the only ones I know. The brave students at Columbia, those who did, who came out against all of this and against the oppression of their resistance to all of this, and who have been cleared off their campus by police, coming in on the behest of the president of Columbia University. Some of you may know I once worked there. The way I left was such that I would have sued them if I could have. I couldn't have for very technical reasons. But that's not important. What is important is that there, as well as in other places, as we know, Google, for instance, as well, there are people who resist and who are coming out to resist and are taking real risks. And this has to continue. The Palestinians are suffering enormously. It's an ordinary duty of humanity not to side with their murderers or the accomplices of their murderers, wherever they are, in the United States and Germany, for instance, but to side with them. And not everybody can do an enormous amount, but everybody can do something. Thank you very much. That was what I felt like saying for today. I hope you have found it, at least to some extent, interesting. And I will be back with another episode soon, of course. Once more, thanks. Thanks again.